Thank you to all the organizers of the JLF in Seattle. We made it to Seattle. That's amazing. It's a wonderful festival. I'm so glad to be here with you all. And especially with Shinipai and Vijay Seshadri, we're going to mix it up a little bit. We're going to hear some poetry, we're going to ask some questions and talk a little bit, and then we're going to open it up to you. And the title of this session is...
Hey folks, settle down.
We love it. Take a stand, Venjoy. The title of the session is Poetics of the Multiverse. So really my first opening is, what does multiverse mean? What universes do you inhabit, especially as a poet?
So should I start?
Yes, please.
And the mic is working? And yeah. I was lying in bed thinking, what was I going to do this morning? And a lot of the things that have been addressed, I've come to a lot of the sessions, have to do with issues of migration and issues of culture, especially in relationship to South Asia and America. And I thought I'd start by, giving a sense of what lies under certain aspects of my writing that have to do with things a lot of people in this room share, which is the negotiation and the transference from one culture to another. Amitabha yesterday was talking about V.S. Naipaul, and there's a late piece by Naipaul about Gandhi, which is very, very interesting, in his book called A Writer's People. And Naipaul has written very well about Gandhi, and what he says about Gandhi in this book, in this essay, was a revelation. He says that the problem Gandhi faced was how to fit one culture into another, that was the deepest way to understand Gandhi, and he created a persona in some sense. And and I think that's what we poets always do. We somehow confront a crisis of the self, and it might have to do with acculturation from one civilization to another. It might have to do with a crisis of the self within one society, but it's always kind of a gap between the inner and outer worlds that creates this crisis, and somehow we have to resolve it. And I think that's true of everyone. I mean, I think poetry is an aspect of sort of universal human endeavor in a way, but it's particularly the case, I feel, in my life as someone who's lived here in America since the Eisenhower era, but has never really sort of resolved my relationship to either this society or my background, that had led me to being a poet. And I think that crisis of the self, I call it crisis as if it's I don't mean that word to be negative in any way, it's actually a source of fascination for me and interest, and that's why I sort of became a poet, I think. And the great Indian scholar and critic A.K. Ramanujan has this metaphor when he's talking about the Indian epics, and he says that new stories develop in epic traditions the way crystals develop in a system of crystals, that crystals always grow along the flaws of a crystal. New crystals form, and I kind of think about the poems I write in that way.
Along the crisis line, essentially.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way to think of, because I've also been thinking, what multiverse? What do we mean? What are we talking about today?
Right.
And I love that idea of it sort of being those the axes upon which our various experiences, cultures, and worlds kind of spin, sometimes clashing with each other and sometimes in harmony, but they bring something there. I love the crystals grow along the crisis line. I'm going to keep that. That's a poet line I'm going to keep just tuck in my pocket there. What about you, Shini?
So when I thought about the multiverse as a very kind of undefined framework for this panel, my mind went to pop culture and thinking about the Hollywood film Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is a narrative about an immigrant and diasporic family and the multiple kind of identities that those individuals that are in the story kind of occupy in terms of who they might have been had they not immigrated, and what those relationships between family members might have looked like. So I think that I kind of approach this topic in terms of thinking about how expansive can we be. I think the multiverse for me is kind of tied to the different kinds of identities that I occupy and what communities that I'm a part of. And in thinking about the panel today and what kind of work that I might want to share, I thought a lot about my interests in the sensorial world. So I write a lot about place, and I write about, for lack of better words, nature, which is not a term I'm liking to use as much these days as I kind of think about what it means to be an ecological individual, and this idea of being in community with more than human beings or non-human beings, and what it means to attune to the voices of the non-human beings that are around us, and vibrating and resonating within us, whether those are animals, insects, trees, rocks, and this kind of multiverse that is inclusive of and expansive beyond the human experience.
Okay, so now we've added new accesses to this idea of multiverse. Now we have the culture and identity and experience accesses, but now we're also adding in the human experience of the world and the world's experience of us, that there's something within the multiverse of ecological systems that we're also traversing as human beings, whether we're aware of it or not. I'm loving this. Okay, so I'm wondering, Vijay, will you share a piece or two that kind of speaks to that multiverse for you?
Sure, I prepared.
Yes. We love prepared readers.
I was prepared, for this. I actually, I should tell you a little more about my history. I was, when I was 20, to the shock of my parents when I was growing up in the Midwest, I was, for the Indian families who my parents knew, an example of the terrible things that might happen to their children, because they happened to me when I was 20. I graduated from college and I hitchhiked out to California and lived in the Bay Area and drove a truck and worked as a floor refinisher. And then I moved up to the Central Oregon coast and I spent 5 years as a commercial fisherman. And my parents were kind of very strange people, but they were really wonderful. They, wrung their hands, but they let me live, and I think it was really the process of forging the identity in relationship to the multiplicity of existence. And, and I wrote a poem recently that went back to that experience, but is also a poem very much about trying to fit different worlds and different civilizations and different multitudes in your own mind together. And I'll read that. And it's called The Estuary, and it's from my last book. The brown bear living near the estuary and wading out when the tide swells and the salmon run, during the days of the dwindling salmon runs, and slapping with his big right paw hook-nosed fish, whipsawing inland to spawn, the ambidextrous bear, furred like the forest from which he emerged, waddling into the unteachable waters to swat the salmon out the fast-running tide and catch the red salmon in his mouth, and toss and juggle the sockeye salmon, thrashing and drowning in the air, And when he's expressed himself completely, he catches with his jaw the self that swam 10,000 miles to the estuary, and daintily, mincingly, with one paw grasping the caudal fin and the other the head, eats that salmon as if he were we, and the fish and ear of boiled corn. That bear is a bear about whom rich and complicated feelings can be felt. That is a bear from whom ideas about the state of nature can be derived. Cruelty is the wrong word to describe the pleasure he gets from playing with his lunch. Play and life are the same thing to him. Art and life, life and death. Creation impinging on a consciousness clear and crystalline, pinpoint revelatory explosions unsoiled by words, unbesmirched, creation clambering out of the waters, shaking itself off, creation surrounding itself with itself. Stay down on the pavement where you just fell in a heap, like a bag of laundry. Just stay there. Move even a little and you might damage something else. You've already done plenty of damage. Stay down, supine, stay down, and let the giant buildings loom over you. Let them in their abstract imperium stun you with their indifference. Wasn't that the reason you built them in the first place? Stay down, and ask yourself, could I be the bear in this fable? Could I be the fish? Could I be whoever is imagining all this? That's it. Ooh. Thank you.
Yes.
The thing about that poem is that, can I say something about my own work?
Please do.
Okay. Is that, having spent all my life up to the time I wrote that poem trying to fit one civilization into the other and one aspect of myself into another aspect of myself, I decided it was actually impossible, and that my whole life was a futile attempt to, achieve something I could never achieve. So the structure of the poem is that it's just broken back in the middle, It suddenly goes from this image of nature to a person who's lying, in a heap in a city.
Feeling very urban, yes.
Yeah.
At the trap door of your poem, right there. We fall through it.
Yeah, and and I guess it's I think the value of poetry is that ultimately it can make our contradictions so clear, and maybe that's all we're left with, just.
Questions. I was actually drawn to the questions in this piece too. Not just the questions at the end, but throughout there's this sort of like wondering about the self that is unresolved and remains unresolved. And that's a beautiful thing I think about poetry too, is that we're not required to resolve anything for you, actually. We can just leave you with the question. We're not telling the end of the story.
I know, we get away with murder. Yeah, we really do. Yeah.
We can draw the knife and then put it down. Or did we put it down? What happened to the knife? Where did it go? What about you, Shinny? Do you want to share, please?
This is a poem that I wrote last year that is about a group of trees that were very important to the community here in Seattle, in Pike Place, that were cut down, and just what the community reaction was around it. The piece is inspired by the work of the thinker and artist Jenny Odell, who wrote How to Do Nothing. It's called Saving Time, with thanks to Jenny Odell. They weren't given time to flower once more. In the week after daylight savings, the light grown longer, the temperature warmer. Our city chainsawed them down, declaring them diseased, though arborists that campaigned to save the sakuras saw no evidence of decay. And once the cherry trees were stumps, affirmed healthy heartwood and cambium. These trees had no voice, so activists cited the Japanese-American story. The farmers who once moved produce at Pike Place before their removal, though some resisted. Nature, like people, has been known to stand its ground, like that rogue palm tree planted at Alki Beach, or the giant sequoia that's persisted just east of Macy's. They have no value, are deemed worthless despite being wayfinders for all who see trees as time, markers of when we are, versus trees as canopy and shade. And the local news is quickly subsumed by the doom scroll of more important stories. The diesel derail in Anacortes, 3,100 gallons of hazardous fuel spilled on Swinomish territory. Government and business forget to think about who was here before. In their forward-thinking versions and visions of development, losing touch with witness. Trees chopped down before they could bloom again, complete their cycle, like salmon returning to spawn, sakura petals like snow blanketing Pike Street again.
Wow, thank you so much. Salmon, oh my gosh, what it is, we got to take a little tangent here, poets. What is it about the struggle of salmon, the insistence of their pet? What is it about salmon that just like comes back as a, is it the metaphor of it? What is it for you?
Yeah, I mean, I love the way you came, the circle down from the trees to the salmon. That was a fantastic move, you know, a real nice transformation in that poem, you know. And of course, salmon, who are kind of worshipped in this area by the, you know, the Indians of the Pacific Northwest, are a remarkably spiritual fish, right? Because they go from the fresh water to salt water and back. They make this incredible journey, you know, and all of the anadromous fish species, I think, are the most poetic of the, you know, aquatic animals, you know, even more so than the mammals, right? The marine mammals that everybody celebrates. And, you know, I went down to Pike Place, actually, yesterday and just looked at the big salmon and but that was a beautiful poem.
Yes.
It was really, you know.
What is it for you, Shani, that about the salmon? Like, why did it come down to the salmon for you, from the trees to the salmon?
Yeah, I mean, they are, you know, super northwesty symbol, but I think living here as somebody who didn't come from this region, salmon are such a species that we can feel so connected to. Like my young son, when he was in kindergarten, part of his classwork was actually the schools had salmon roe that they hatched and they grew, and the idea was that they would bring them to the river and put them, or to the waterways, and to put them back in the waterways. That got a little hijacked by pandemic. They didn't get to see the process through, but something that we've had a chance to experience is being able to go to Carkeek Park and to see the salmon spawning in the creek that's there every year. And so there's this real connection here felt, you know, with the life and death of the salmon species, whether you're going to Carkeek Park or you're watching them, you know, hop over the salmon ladders and the ballard locks. It's just a real physical, geographical connection to this species.
Yeah.
I think that it's interesting. I also didn't grow up in this area, and for me, salmon have always been this sort of alien insistence on self. And that's like, from the moment I heard about what salmon do to come home and how much they work, like watching them, especially when they're jumping right into the bear's mouth as they're making their leap, and you have the rows of bears just taking their feast. It's so wild to have such an instinct to insist on self like that, insist on return. And we get so lost, I think. We were talking about transversing these cultures, these spaces, these times, and what we feel maybe we have to shed or set aside to better operate within a new system or a new multiverse. What does it mean to hold on to that insistence of self? There's something really sticky and tangible for me about, like, what does it mean to be a salmon? And to insist on that, to insist on return home. It's fascinating, because I wouldn't do it. I'd give up. the end of my line.
Right, yeah.
We'd end in the salt water. I don't even know if I'd swim back into the cold water. Like, I don't know. I don't know if I'd do the freshwater transformation.
If you had to, you'd do it.
But and that's the thing. What makes you have to then,
Yeah.
right? So then we can get into the philosophy of the poetry of this. But
Yeah.
I do want to know, what languages have you learned because of the different universes you've ended up having to occupy? What kind of languages, not literal languages, but what have you learned so that you can talk among the new people or for the new people? What are the languages you're now speaking? Who do you speak for? Who do you hope your poetry speaks for?
Maybe you should start instead of,
Okay. So a lot of my work is about visual art and visual artists. I come very specifically from an immigrant family where I don't really share a common language with my mother specifically. She came to the United States in her late 20s, not speaking a word of English, and so when she came and then she had children, she didn't have a great opportunity to dive deeply into the learning of this language, and then as I was born and I grew up, there was this kind of loss of the mother language for me after, the age of 5 and going to school. So I think for me, there is always this attention to the visual world, visual language, and symbolism, because there was so much there for me in terms of being able to connect to my mother. And I have Spanish and Taiwanese in my background as languages, but and as a young emerging writer, I practice translation a small amount just as a practice. But I think the languages that I've gravitated towards have really been concerned with different creative practices. As a writer, I have also simultaneously had a visual art practice as a photographer. But I also do some performance, I make art installations, and I learn a lot of different arts and practices like letterpress printing, just to be able to speak the languages of these different practices so that I can understand what they feel like in the body, and they likewise then expand the way that I think or write or practice as an artist. And so those are the languages that have really served me in my practice.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for that. Vijay, what about you? What other languages do you have?
Well, I mean, I think, in terms of historical languages that humans in the world speak, I know like 6 languages very badly, including English. And, and I mean, my family were Tamil and Kannada speakers in India, and my mother and father would speak both languages to each other as I was growing up, and they would code switch, but they were also English educated. They came from a sort of English education medium, and I started learning English when I was 3 in India. And, oddly enough, which I guess, points to the other pathos of my life when I think about it, that, the foreign language I know best is French, and then Spanish, and I learned Hindi and Urdu as an adult, so I can kind of make my way around in reading especially, and in a kind of hapless attempt to try to reconnect with India, and then I gave that up. I said, forget it, this will never happen. I mean, it's like, and so but I think your question had to do with language at a deeper level, like what going back to my initial statement about, the poetry being a response to the crisis of the self. And and language is essential to that. And I guess what my writing, if I look at it in a very deep way, if I put the question marks down deep enough, as Wittgenstein says, has to do with is a constant attempt to recover and create a demotic American speech, which has always been sort of, since Whitman, the quest for American poetry. And I always say that, well, since, and I should say this because this whole election we're in the middle of, which is going to be so depressing going forward, having to deal with all this, really has to do so much with migration and migrants and, demonizing migrants and stuff like that. And, for me, the struggle has always been to fit myself into this language I find myself in such a way that I can make it my own. And that has a particular intensity, I think, for the migrant poet, And I always say that, well, the society is going to accord me or not accord me a status as an American or not an American, and they're going to problematize my identity in some way. But I know that I'm an American poet. I might or might not be an American, and I don't particularly want to be a part of any nation at all. I don't want to be an American or an Indian or a Frenchman, It's all bullshit, right? It's all like, I mean, come on, really? This incredible, masterly, mystic thing, the human self, you're going to reduce it to a passport, It's like ridiculous, right? It's like, please, And those Haitians who, Trump says are eating dogs, I mean, think about their souls. I mean, they have, they're connected to the infinite in the same way that we are. And, like, come on. Why would they eat dogs? I mean, it's like so, I mean, I can't believe how stupid this election is. I'm sorry, it should not be.
Okay.
That we even have to think about these things.
Yes.
That we even have to think about these stupidities and, have them pollute our minds and our consciousness is just like, very, upsetting to me.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, I didn't mean to get political, but.
I see. I mean, you can't not. I think that's that is the state of what you're saying is when you get back to the humanist principles, you find yourself going, wait, if we're all humans, we're all experiencing this existence right now from our own perspectives. Yeah. I love this idea of to reduce it down to a passport is silly, and to further isolate is silly. I think. What I'm hoping for, and I'm hoping you both will share at least one more piece before we open it up to the audience for questions. What I'm hoping for is, do you have a piece to share that maybe speaks a little bit to the different languages you're trying to embody, or the different languages you speak in, or why? Will you share with us? And Shin, why don't you go first?
Can I share two poems, relatively short?
Yes, please.
Okay. And they're related. So last year, I spent some time in Southern California, near the region where I grew up. There was an outdoor biennial art fair called Desert X. And so this is about two different pieces that I saw in that area. One of them, the second poem, is based on the work of a Turkish artist named Rana Begum. And she works a lot with chain link fencing that she puts in the landscape. So that's the second poem that I'll read. But the first one that I'll read is a poem that was inspired by the photographs of Tyree Nichols. So Tyree Nichols was a young African-American person and emerging artist who was stopped at a routine traffic stop where he was living and beaten so severely by officers, police, that he later died of his injuries. And the curators of this art festival went to his family knowing that he had been an emerging photographer and asked for a group of his photographs that they could blow up and put on billboards on the side of the road in the Palm Springs, Palm Desert area. And while his work was shown around, next to world-class artists from around the world, but I think for me, seeing those works were so deeply moving, more than a lot of the other pieces in this outdoor art festival. So I'll read these two pieces. At the Side of the Road, for Tyree Nichols. Lining both sides of the highway roadside signs, my eye caught sight of the pictures the 29-year-old took down in Memphis, his adopted home, which he cared for by photographing. There was no way to slow down, go back, or park the car to process the information coming toward me in the back seat of the fast-moving car. I aimed my camera at billboards that blurred as I passed by. The removal of my eye filtered through a device, leaving me cold and distanced in the desert wind like the wall between reading and sensing another news story. And recognizing at once his name and gaze, how different to feel into his likenesses, signposts, images of bridges, water and stone, markers shining at sunset. And this is Yellow Chain Link after the work of Rana Begum. My son threw himself down on hot sand despite his fear of rattlesnakes and scorpions, crawling the desert floor at twilight, pulled himself through the hole in the fence, a narrow half-foot opening, to move past its material. Once on the other side and safe, he crossed through more barriers to venture closer to the center of his attention. I had described the piece to him with unremarkable language as a fence outdoors to manage his expectations of art and tune the focus towards the presence of fences around us at border crossings, what these walls say about policies on immigration, who gets to come over and why. And later, when we are waved through a border checkpoint without being stopped, I remind myself, the child of immigrants, of what it means to have papers and be documented.
Thank you, Shinny. Wow. Wow. I love that language of visual arts that you were speaking to. That's so visceral there. Thank you. How about you, Vijay? Will you close us with a poem before we open it up for the audience to ask questions? So if you have questions, get them ready.
I'll read the first poem in which I ever sort of started using Indic material. And I'll be very frank and say that this is appropriation, you know, because it's a poem that's very much in an American context, and I don't want to be let off the hook. I don't want people to think, oh, he was born in India, so it's okay for him to appropriate. You know, I want to be chastised and castigated for my appropriation, and you know, and I want to revel in it, and I do.
We've learned so much about you today, Vijay.
I know. I know. Anyway, it's based on an incident at the end of the Mahabharata, the Sanskrit epic poem that all of you know is, what is it, 9 times the volume of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. And you know, and I thought about this incident for a long, long time, and you know, at least from the time I first encountered it when I was in my teens, I think, when I first read about the Mahabharata, and it always stuck in my mind, and suddenly it came bubbling up, and I had that experience that you both probably know, that it was a poem that wrote itself. You know, it's so wonderful that happens. You know, that might have happened to me twice in my
friend
life.
says it falls out of you like a baby giraffe and just stands up and walks away.
No, yeah, exactly. You know, I mean, it's so fantastic, you know, when that happens. Anyway, and so I'll read it. Anyway, it's called The Long Meadow. Near the end of one of the old poems, the sun of righteousness, the source of virtue and civility, on whose back the kingdom is carried, as on the back of the tortoise the earth is carried, passes into the next world. The wood is dark, the wood is dark, and on the other side of the wood the sea is shallow, warm, endless. In and around it there is no thread of life. So little is the atmosphere charged with possibility that he might as well be wading through a flooded basement. He wades for what seems like forever, and never stops to rest in the shade of the metal rain trees, springing out of the water at fixed intervals. Time, though endless, is also short. So he wades on until he walks out of the sea and into the mountains, where he burns on the windward slopes and freezes in the valleys. After unendurable struggles, he finally arrives at the celestial realm. The god waits there for him. The god invites him to enter. But looking through the glowing portal, he sees on that happy plain not those he thinks wait eagerly for him, his beloved, his brothers, his companions in war and exile, all long since dead and gone, but sitting pretty and enjoying the gorgeous sunset, his cousin and bitter enemy, the cause of that war, that exile, whose arrogance and vicious indolence plunged the world into grief. The god informs him that yes, those he loved have been carried down the river of fire. Their thirst for justice offended the cosmic powers, who are jealous of justice. In their place in the celestial realm, called Alaukika in the ancient texts, the breaker of faith is now glorified. He, at least, acted in keeping with his nature. Who has not felt a little of the despair the Son of Righteousness now feels, staring wildly around him? The god watches, not without compassion and a certain wonder. This is the final illusion, the one to which all the others lead. He has to pierce through it himself, without divine assistance. He will take a long time about it, with only his dog to keep him company. The mongrel dog, celebrated down the millennia, who has waited with him, shivered and burned with him, and never abandoned him to his loneliness. That dog bears a slight relationship to my dog, a skinny, restless, needy, overprotective mutt who was rescued from a crack house by Suzanne. On weekends, when I can shake free during the week, I take her to the Long Meadow in Prospect Park, where dogs are allowed off the leash in the early morning. She's gray-muzzled and old now, but you can't tell that by the way she runs. Thanks.
Wow. You did it again. Trapdoored us. Thank you so much. I love both of these. Both of these poets are phenomenal. Give it up for Shani and Vijay. Do we have any? I think we had time for maybe one question. Does anybody have a question? Because I do want to know if anybody's coming up to the mic beforehand. Will you talk a little bit about being the Seattle's civic poet, what that means, and what your project is?
Yeah. Do you have those postcards? Or?
Yes, I do.
Yes. Okay.
Right here.
I'm the civic poet of Seattle currently, which is like poet laureate role, basically, which means kind of serving as an ambassador for poetry for the community. So some of my big projects have included putting poetry on National Public Radio on our local station KUOW last year during the entire month of April. But this spring, I also did a particular visual poetry campaign that involved, that involved curating poems from the public. So I did an open call asking people, what kind of poems would you like to read? And people sent in a lot of ideas, but the idea that really rose to the surface is that people want to hear and read poems about Seattle. So then I invited the community to send me poems about communities in Seattle, both human and more than human, and what would it mean for those communities to thrive. And out of that, I ended up taking 5 different poems from 5 different authors and partnering with 7 different sites around Seattle Seattle to basically curate and design and create these visual poetry installations that existed during the month of April as window displays and also kind of sculptural installations with the idea that people could walk through on the street and into these spaces to see poetry and encounter it in a very visceral, embodied way. And the poems that we got were really incredible from the community. I had a lot of general poems about like salmon, like pine trees, but like the best ones were, you know, like a poem about the displacement of African Americans in the Central District here in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, and also a really incredible poem by Brina Antonio Cortez, which was a poem about her relationship to our Little Saigon neighborhood or Little Vietnam. And my designer, she chose a designer of a typeface that created a typeface for Vietnamese font or language, and then we went back to Brina and asked if maybe she'd be interested in translating that work or having it translated, this English poem, into Vietnamese. So she actually went to her grandfather and asked if he would translate it for her, and we ended up creating and displaying it as a bilingual version. And so my work here as civic poet has really been about platforming poetry by poets who aren't, you know, widely known, who aren't like, you know, poets with MFAs, who aren't intellectual. You know, they're really straight from the community, and that has been the honor of my work as Seattle civic poet. Thanks.
Thank you, Shini and Vijay. Thank you so much. Oh, I don't. We have no, is what I heard. I'm so sorry, but please find these poets, go buy their book, and get it signed by them, and ask your question. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Devika, and all the organizers of JLF. Thank you all for being here and listening so wonderfully.